the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, we just want to mention briefly, we've got a Patreon account at www.patreon.com/MUHH, and we have begun making access to our Discord available to patrons. Taylor's kind of heading that up and doing some reading groups there, so just a way for us to try to give something back to our patrons, because we have a strong ethical stance against putting our episodes behind a paywall. We want to share those with everyone, but that's a little benefit that we've just started adding. That aside, we're very happy to have Duane Rousselle returning to the show for the first time in a couple of years. He's a sociological theorist, Lacanian psychoanalyst, associate dean of research, and associate professor, and this is your current role, I believe, Duane, is that correct? At the Aga Khan University in Karachi, yes. Pakistan?
Mm-hmm.
Great to have you back, Duane. I feel like you and I have it's like we're cut from the same cloth in a lot of ways, in that not only do you have the interest in Lacan and Stirner, but also sociology, which I think will be more so the focus of today's discussion. So I'm just looking forward to I've been wanting to talk about sociology because we've been doing some excursions into, we did Marcel Maus's book on, it was like a general theory of magic. What else did we look at, Taylor, that's
that was a few weeks ago. We did Mauss, which is interesting because you bring up Durkheim in a couple of chapters, Duane. Mauss famously, not his most famous attribute, but he is famously known as Durkheim's like protege and nephew. We did that. We did the Stirner. We've done a little bit of Schrader's book on contracts, right? Is that what you're thinking of, Coop?
Yeah, I guess for Hegel's philosophy of right as well. But that,
we started on Hegel's philosophy of right. We got a couple of these like book series. Whenever we don't have a guest, we tend to start a new book series, and who knows if we'll ever
we've got about
come
5
back and
books.
finish them.
We need to finish at this point.
We've got Schrader, Hegel, and it's interesting, right? Because I think that most people might expect us to do the Hegel's phenomenology or science of logic, but really because we were delving into these more sociological areas, it's like why don't we do some of the elements of the philosophy of right to see what Hegel has to say on like property and these other things. So I guess that I know that Coop was interested in the sociology, because the book we're talking about today, which came out this year by Bloomsbury, is Psychoanalytic Sociology, a new theory of the social bond. Is that correct, Duane? Did I get the title right?
Yes, that is the title that the publisher chose.
I was going to ask you about that. If that was your title, did you have a working title in mind that would have maybe...
The title was Singularities.
That makes sense.
Or a variant of it, the era of singularities, something like that. But the problem was that there are other books with that title. It's hard to sell it as a textbook. And so, as usual with my book titles, I'm not sure I ever chose the title of a book ever, except for my independently published books. I just said, okay, whatever.
At this point, it's interesting because there's something similar with the translation that's coming out in November of, I translated this book by Axel Chernyavsky, and in the original French, the title is Concept and Method, and then the subtitle is something like Deleuze's Conception of Philosophy. And for Edinburgh Press, which is a juggernaut in the Deleuze publishing industry, they want Deleuze's name in the title, not the subtitle. And, at a certain point, Axel and I both, we didn't really fight this all that hard. But I think that one thing that leaves out, for example, having singularities in the title would be more faithful to what you investigate. Even if the subtitle is very clear, A New Theory of the Social Bond, it doesn't really give you what is going to be the gem of the book. Same thing with leaving out the term method. I think that the gem of that book I was just talking about, the real pearl in the oyster, is what is Deleuze's method, which I think is a unique perspective. But again, they're thinking from a marketing perspective, which you can't really fault them on too much. But I guess that's perhaps what Bloomsbury was thinking of too. How will this distinguish itself as a singularity in the marketer's eye? In any case, yeah. So if Coop, you want to focus on the sociology stuff, I will make sure not to leave Lacan out of the mixture.
I think maybe to help maybe situate Duane, as far as personally, I have been on this investigation, even though maybe not, I haven't declared it as such. Thinking about the social bond really stems back to Moses and monotheism, which might be a little bit counterintuitive, but I think ever since that episode, I don't know, just I suppose, the ties to the primal father and I suppose what else, prohibitions and guilt and all that sort of thing, and how these, what role those have to play in the social bond. We looked at also the work of Girard a bit.
That's another we started, I guess that's another open-ended series of violence in the sacred. But Duane, you yourself, and come back to you, Coop, because I'm trying to make these connections. You yourself analyze the Abrahamic religions in the triad of, imaginary, symbolic, real. And so that ties into a little bit, maybe a more Lacanian reading of what's going on at the heart of Moses and monotheism, as Coop was saying.
I can't remember if we had instituted this, but we had begun starting off the podcast in earnest with having our guests describe, if you have one, a sort of philosophical origin story. So this could be, you saw a film, you took a class, you met someone, you read a book, some type of singular encounter with philosophy that perhaps, got your sort of ignited your passion.
Did we fail to ask Duane about his origin story?
I can't recall. And we might, it was a while back, so I don't know if we had begun asking that question at that point in time.
Now that you've done hundreds of podcasts, Duane, you may not remember either. But even though sometimes we have a returning guest, so even if you did tell an origin story, feel free to either retell it or tell it with a slant, whatever crystallized some of your interest, including, as Coop said, not just that origin in your interest in philosophy and psychoanalysis, but perhaps down that road, including, stuff that we talked about before the show, post-anarchism, Lacan, psychoanalysis more generally. Just take us on a journey.
So I'm just going to think spontaneously. I haven't actually given a narrative of this before, and I hadn't actually sincerely thought about it. But the first thought that comes to me is really a memory. I was in sociology as an undergraduate student. I ended up in sociology by chance. I was on the path to be a computer programmer, but through a series of political changes in Canada, my admission into a computer science program was revoked, and I went on a hunger strike, which is pretty easy for me to do because I'm a male anorexic, in front of the registrar's office. And this was happening a lot, standing and protesting, going in, meeting the dean, meeting the chair of the computer science department, and so on, trying to get back in. And they recognized in my activity something of a type of activism, which they had associated in their mind with sociology. Actually is not that far off the mark, because I think, let's say during the 1960s, 1970s, a serious number of counterculture folks were seeking some sort of a sophisticated language to articulate their discontents. And of course, they were not, for various reasons, moving into psychoanalysis to do that, even though psychoanalysis had charged itself with rising up to be capable of speaking about and isolating the discontents of a given time or society. So they thought, I'm an activist, you should do sociology. That kind of worked out. But while I'm in sociology, I'm recognizing how implicated it seems to be in what at the time I thought, to use the language of some of the Western Marxists, particularly a Canadian sociologist named Dorothy Smith, it seemed to be enmeshed in the ruling relations. A lot of knowledge translation, a lot of politicians involved, a lot of policy research and this sort of stuff, which I had associated with establishment. Whether it is or not, that's how I associated it. And I remember that in a certain way, I thought it made too much sense. And I was at a party with a friend of mine who is a real philosopher. He still is a real philosopher who I grew up with. And I was in the bathroom. And in his bathroom, during this party, I saw George Bataille's Story of the Eye. And I read it in one shitting.
You read it in one shitting. I love that. I'm gonna have to steal that. That's
yeah, which I mean is not exactly a work of philosophy, but I saw something in it. And I was talking to my friend about Bataille, and I learned all about sociology and the connection of sociology to philosophy and to psychoanalysis, particularly through the College of Sociology and so on. And that brought me to see in philosophy, I think, an obscure language.
a cant, if you will, to think about your last intervention on cant laughter, but a cant, the cant of philosophy.
Yeah, it was, I liked when things didn't fully make sense. And I mean, that brought me to a number of philosophers in the continental tradition who were reading Bataille, which includes, I mean, we talked about Marcel Mauss, and we all know the relationship there as well. So these are a network of thinkers, but it brought me to Derrida, who I became a little bit fanatical with, and Foucault and so on, and reading their work very deeply. And it was as simple as this. I noticed that I wasn't necessarily so much of a unique thinker because so much of the identity of the philosophers that I knew were implicated in the same philosophers as I. So I thought the same thing that Zizek thought about, if you want to be taken seriously as a person who knows something about classical composition, you never say you like Beethoven. You say Mahler or something like this. And so Lacan was that person. I mean, everybody's heard of his name. Nobody's really studying him. That's how I got to Lacan. And I originally entered Lacan's work through Zizek and through philosophy, and even through the debates between Derrida and Lacan and so on. And then the story from there gets really interesting, but I'll leave it. It moves in a clinical direction after that. But that's basically, I think, my first encounter with philosophy was with its obscure language game. It wasn't about how it was asking the right questions. It also wasn't about how it was providing answers that hitherto I couldn't discover, like, oh, it was answering all my questions. It was that it was speaking nonsense in a way that I thought was quite enjoyable. I would call it the feminine quality of philosophy that I was attracted to. I say that purely in a psychoanalytic sense, not in a sexual sense. You know, it was the enigma of philosophy. It inevitably brought me to François Laruelle, of course, who I was just fascinated by and still am, Deleuze and some of these other thinkers who I think in a roundabout way got to me before I could discover the late Lacan, where Lacan was using the phrase la langue. I think that's as true of a story as I could possibly tell about my origin story in philosophy.
I think that's great. I think that weaves together some of the details that you leave along the way in this book in particular. For example, starting with your admission of anorexia, which I know drop early on in the book. I like the answer about the obscure language. And is it Seminar 20 where feminine jouissance is described as one of the faces of God, right? It's this, there is something that is there, I guess the part of the jouissance or the enjoyment is in the perplexity, is in the fact that things aren't working out so easily. Now, there are variants of philosophy and philosophers that might try to precisely answer questions or to provide these so-called simple solutions. But I think that that's not necessarily something we get from whether it be Lacanian discourse or even from someone like Deleuze, who we tend to cover on the show, where really for Deleuze, it's about determining problems rather than merely pretending like they're easily solvable. I think that I resonate with that a lot. And I think that trajectory makes a lot of sense. Now, we'll have to have you on a third time. Maybe we can hear that third time more about your interest in anarchism and maybe how that ties into the clinic, which, but we'll leave some grist on the mill. Coop, were you going to say something? I apologize.
Yeah. Part of my origin story involves my intro to sociology class, which really was a tremendous paradigm shift in my thinking. I was going to do a 2-year associate's degree in like network administration, so like running the wide area network at some organization. But my intro to sociology class impacted my thinking so much that it changed the whole direction of my studies and what degree. And I ended up, long story short, is I ended up double majoring in English and sociology for my undergrad. So I don't know, just another example of how we sort of, or like I said, cut from a similar cloth, I suppose. But not to derail us into that, I just thought that was such an interesting encounter, I suppose, to highlight for you.
I had a similar instance in undergrad. That was where I was first exposed to the work of Marx. Maybe not every sociology intro class is going to necessarily cover, aspects of whether it be the manifesto, or I know one of the texts that I read shortly after that, Duane, which you work through, you devote a whole chapter to, is the 1844 philosophical economic manuscripts, where we do get this fourfold sort of conceptualization of alienation or estrangement. And so I resonated with that aspect. And but I guess I'm just chiming in with the two of you to say sociology did have a little bit to do with leading me toward a more, I don't want to say radical path, but let's just say toward a path that I didn't know that horizon was open to me, or hadn't yet been open.
I love the way you just put that, Taylor, because as you were speaking, I was thinking about the way in which we're talking about our origin stories. And in a way, I'm hearing in my speech, in all of our speech, some latent admissions about, let's say, that could be mapped onto modal logic. I'm not a philosopher. In fact, I don't quite believe in anti-philosophy, although some people say Lacan's an anti-philosopher.
Right.
He says, I rise up against philosophy somewhere in his later work. And my first thick book on Lacanian realism was an engagement with La Ruelle's non-philosophy in reading Freud. But this modal logic that Lacan develops is quite interesting, because if I'm thinking back of how I encountered sociology, it began through an encounter with what's impossible. And my admission into a sociology program it took me somewhat by surprise. It was contingent. And as I'm moving through all these years, decades, I come out the other end, and my book really, what it's really about in a way, and where it's led me, I wish I could have, it's always after I put a book out that I realize what I should have been saying in one page.
Nachtraglichkeit, right? The après coup.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And what I discovered was that Lacan was a sociologist, and he was a sociologist of a different kind. He was more sociological than any sociologist I've read. Psychoanalysis is a sociology in of itself, because Lacan says in his late teaching, 1970s, he says, I paraphrase because I don't have the exact expression, but you can find it. He says, what is social is always on the side of what's possible. And he says it in relation to discourse and so on. at some point in the last 5 years or less, I discovered that sociology was about what's possible and what's necessary. So it's a movement from encountering it as an impossibility, which is a way we tend to read Lacan as a theorist of the impossible, because he was so implicated in the events of 1960s uprisings, like any other of the French intellectual milieu. Be realistic, demand the impossible, and all this sort of stuff. We tend to fashion a Lacan of the impossible, of the contingent, and this is the real, and so on. But in some sense, he was really a thinker of what's possible and what's necessary. And he was a sociologist insofar as he was. And this is how I come back to sociology in this book. From this perspective, Lacan's sociology was epitomized in his building of a psychoanalytic world. I don't know how else to put it, an institution that he called the school, with an instrument that I think is anarchist. I get in some trouble. I just had a little bit of a debate with an analyst who's quite a well-known analyst in the World Association of Psychoanalysis, because I used the word anarchist, and I'm using it in a different way.
In an affirmative way, not what might be taken pejoratively by others. Is that?
But also in a more Stirnerian way.
Okay, yes.
Because Stirner, I think he was tempted by what's possible, but he could never get to the possible. This is what I tried to convince some people of in Belfast 2 weeks ago at an anarchist studies conference. I just looked like a crazy person. And I am a crazy person, so it's fine. But Lacan, in producing an anarchic structure, an anarchic epistemic structure known as the cartel, in building the school, in dissolving the school, all of these are explorations of what's possible for an impossible profession. I think that that's what this book allowed me to do. It came at a time of war. I was writing it as a refugee. The first part of the book, you can't tell. I was prophesizing a war to come, but the war didn't come yet. The first part of the book, I was actually speaking to students in Russia, and I'm saying, watch out now. The way NATO's structured, you can hear this stuff. Take this really serious. This is before Russia started setting up its war games on the Russian side of the Ukraine border and so on. And then the middle part of the book, I'm in Kazakhstan, I'm in Hungary, and I'm going to Ireland. The last part of the book, I'm living under a temporary protection order. And so much of what's inventive and possible in anarchism, in psychoanalysis, in sociology happens during these moments of war, of the real, of contingency, of impossibility. The affinity group developed at a time of war. The cartel, Lacan took that from a model that was developed in the United Kingdom during a time of war, used with soldiers. And so I think this book really brought me to appreciate sociology as an exploration of the possible, and psychoanalysis as an exploration and invention of what's possible, not simply as an impossible profession.
I like that interesting notion of you're on the eve of war and you're thinking through a new theory of the social bond, which you didn't come up with the title or subtitle, and the fact that when one might think that the social bond is at its most frayed, that's when precisely a need or a call to rethink it, to theorize it, comes about. And you're right, there is a sense in which there can be and it depends again on, and I know that some of your debate with Zizek comes about on maybe perhaps privileging late for you or early Lacan, and so, but the real can be, the slogan as it being impossible can be overstated perhaps if we lose sight of what you just mentioned about this question of the social as that which is possible and necessary.
May I just say
Please.
one thing? One of the things I noticed about, let's say, the Slovenian school, obviously a privileging of early middle Lacan, a certain notion of the unconscious and so on. It's only through the late Lacan that it made it possible for me to read the early and middle Lacan differently. Another reading, you might say,
right.
To see in the late Lacan so much of that thought already at the beginning. from a personal standpoint, I kind of got bored of the early middle Lacan, and I didn't know what to do with it anymore until I really took seriously the late Lacan. So the late Lacan actually rescued the early middle period of Lacan for me, where I'm going back to even his earliest work. I'm going back to even his work on psychosis, where supposedly he develops a theory of psychosis as exclusively operated under foreclosure. When if you read this with some nuance, you can see he's actually talking about foreclosure as a more generalized structure. It's just what is foreclosed.
Right.
Maybe it's not always the nom de pere, maybe, and so it's actually quite strange that the late Lacan is precisely what allowed me to avoid the dogma, to kind of go back and read this stuff in a way that I'm not so clear. I mean, you don't hear the Slovenian school engaging with any of these ideas that come out in the late Lacan. Instead, you hear like, oh, I think Lacan was losing his mind, his not coming undone, and this sort of stuff. And you hear, Zizek's idea that like trying to find some final wisdom in the late Lacan is foolish, and this sort of. I don't think that's what it is at all. It's only the late Lacan that can kind of decipher the early Lacan for me.
Sometimes you see a kind of a parroting or polemicization against the late Lacan because he supposedly moves further and further away from language and discourse towards these knots and these and all of this. And I always took that with a grain of salt. I do think that there is so much work, and I think that Lacan was never too worried about revising his theories. So sometimes I do feel like, you use the word dogma, I feel like there's almost a kind of necessity in putting a halt to the, I'm not going to say revisions, but to the sort of re-envisioning of what psychoanalysis could and perhaps should focus on. And I guess the last thing I would say is, would you, just for my sake, I'm not going to say for my sanity's sake, because this whole question of who is mad is one Lacan himself brings up and that you highlight in the book. Would you say the late Lacan starts, around, is it 17, 20, seminars 20? Because 17, you start having the four discourses, 20, you have the sexuation diagrams, you have the encore. Where for you is that? Do you just think of it as this kind of the 70s, so towards his death in 81?
It's a great question, because a part of me has a hard time even cutting it in that way, because there really is something singular in Lacan's teaching that cannot be cut. But at the same time, I think that for me, there's a real shift that it reaches its penultimate moment in seminar or worse. Okay, so
is that 23?
No, that's
21. I'm sorry, I'm
maybe somebody could Google it real quick. I forgot what number it is. You start to see it the seminar before, but this is where he talks about, because the title is supposed to be the name of the nom de pere or worse, and
19 or sorry, 19. I apologize. Yeah, that's what I had. So I was way off.
I mean, so much of my work depends upon this shift where, there's a line in it. I think I even use it in the book somewhere where Lacan says, I paraphrase, the child is wowed by the father.
Yes.
If he's not wowed, I give it a concept. I give it conceptual value, although I don't treat it as a concept. The wow of the father, to be distinguished from the nom de pere. The wow of the father. If the child is not wowed by the father, he or she or they will be wowed by others, lowercase o. And I take that to mean the comrades, the siblings, the brothers, the fraternities. So the father or worse means precisely that without the father as, let's say, the nom de pere as the linchpin of the social bond or whatever else, what you can have is actually a worse arrangement that's founded not on exploitation, but on segregation. And this is where he's starting to develop a theory of segregation, which is key to my entire book, because he says the comrades, the brothers. And so much of my book tries to show that a lot of thinking in the, let's say, conflict theory and but also it's there in a lot of American sociology, is this idea that there's some sort of, I don't know, C. Wright Mills called it the power elite. There's some sort of governing apparatus there, which we ought to rise up against, or we're feeling estranged from, or whatever. And even in Marx, I use it in the philosophic economic manuscripts with estrangement. There's a sense that we're estranged within a social order. I think at this moment, what Lacan's beginning to develop is, without the father, our social bonds themselves become strange, and we're estranged between social bonds rather than within a social bond. And I say strangeness becomes elevated to the very principle of a social bond. And that's essentially what a singularity is in the book. That's not what psychoanalysts call singularity, but sociologically, I use the phrase singularity to describe a strange social bond where they operate not through exploitation, but through segregation, not through constitutive strangeness, but through segregative strangeness. This is really the foundation of everything in the book. Every little argument I make in the book comes from this perspective. So I see that as a kind of groundbreaking moment, a pivot in Lacan's teaching. On YouTube, there's an interview with Jacques-Alain Miller, where Miller confesses that it took him far too long in his life, Miller being like a disciple of Lacan. It took Miller far too long in his life to realize that in this seminar, Lacan said, on the one hand, there's no such thing as, we can talk about, there's no such thing as a sexual relationship. There's no such thing as a sexual rapport. But the counterpoint to that for Lacan was there is something of the one, which would imply precisely that there is something of a sexual relationship. So he says what there isn't, and he says what there is. And when the father, in some sense, I put it very naively, when the father is not, let's say, desaturating, mortifying our jouissance or whatever else, the social bond itself becomes, I call it saturated in jouissance. It becomes the basis of your sociability. It's Lacan's turn to henology rather than ontology, to his thinking of the one. We can form links with Rainer Sherman if you like that anarchist and so on, because he talks a lot about that. But this is, I think, what singular social bonds are. They're bonds that are formed through jouissance, not through absolving oneself of a certain jouissance to have desire as the price you pay for admission into a social bond. And, if you look at the clinic today, look at, for example, the text by Patricia, whose last name escapes me right now. No, not Garavici. She wrote an orienting text for the new Lacanian school conference called Painful Loves. If you Google Patricia, Painful Loves, and Lacan, you'll find it. In this text, she does something quite remarkable, and she helps to orient a lot of us who work in the clinic. She says a lot of people are relating to their partners as a symptom through jouissance. You have jouissance, a coupling at the level of jouissance. So we form couples that are based upon jouissance. Now, the old clinic, let's say pre-Ronald Reagan, just to give it a history, before 1980, pre-Thatcher, pre-Deng Xiaoping and whoever else, let's say pre-neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it. It's a naive history, but somebody would go into the clinic, complain that they're not sexually satisfied by their wife or their partner, and so they go out. They have maybe a Madonna whore complex, and that's what it was terribly called. And they would go out. They would need this surplus enjoyment elsewhere, whatever. Today we have partner symptoms. We form partnerships with somebody who enjoys in a manner that we find tolerable, and this causes all kinds of new problems in the clinic. And this is what a lot of us are recognizing. So I don't know, I form a partner with a person because they enjoy the same philosophy as me. I form a partnership with a person because they're into the same sexual practices as me. We're part of the same community, but it's at the level of enjoyment. So we haven't relinquished it. And I think that's why, I know I'm talking a lot, but I think there's something really important here. Darian Leader, I think it was, came out with a book a few years ago titled Jouissance. If it wasn't Darian Leader, please forgive me. But it was if I remember correctly, I'll be honest, I didn't read the book. I think the book was basically, and a lot of people on the internet were talking about this, the basic idea was that, well, during the late period of Lacan's teaching, everything was jouissance. Right? It's like everything's jouissance. You have like every concept semblant, everything is reducible to semblant, jouissance. You have jouissance of meaning, you have jouissance, you have everything's jouissance. In some sense, isn't this the problem? It's precisely when some philosophers and clinicians want to do away with the concept of jouissance that we see a pervasiveness of jouissance. That's precisely the problem. We suffer from our enjoyment and from confronting others who enjoy differently than we do. And it produces all kinds of new problems. And that's what I try and outline in the book. New paranoid relationships to others, projections of monsters in other people because we deny our own monstrosity and our own inhumanity. So we see it in Putin when we look in his eyes. We see it in this person, that person's, I don't want to give examples because I'll get in trouble, but everybody's got a different sort of enemy that's outside of their social group. I think this is what we can expect in a time of kind of neo-feudalism, because that's precisely what feudalism is, a social bond where you're segregated from other farms. And your social order is, in some sense, in the farm. You live on the place that you work. You grow food that is for yourself. You're not going out to the market and getting food. I think this period, is it 1968, 1969, something like that? I think was the most essential in my reading of Lacan. It triggered.
You're talking about or worse?
It's or worse. Is it
71, 72.
Oh, 71, 72. Oops.
So
Okay.
so I guess right after the failed May 68, if you want to call it failed, right? The 68 strikes and yeah, I mean, I guess that makes sense as a cutting. But it's right there in the 70s, presaging the Thatcherian, Reaganite eras. And, it's interesting. You bring up that quote, which I had forgotten, about Biden looking in Putin's eyes. And we've seen the other side of that sort of self-proclaimed Zionist leanings, attachments that you're right. There is a little bit of that mirror effect going on. And there's a lot to respond to there, specifically where it comes to segregations, and maybe think of the totem and taboo, Coop, which we covered earlier this year, where you have a kind of, what's interesting to me, I guess, and just to try to link up to one of those ideas you brought out, Duane, was in Freud's reconstruction. It's the brothers band together, they kill the father, they eat pieces of his flesh, and this sets up a new prohibition where no one will ever be the primal father of the horde anymore. And so there is a segregation, but it's built on a kind of repression, a new taboo, a new prohibition. And I think that one of your arguments, leaning towards singularities in this investigation of strangers, is one of your arguments is that this old model of the repressive, prohibitive model of segregation or just alienation, if you will, gives way in the era of singularities. To use your proposed title, in the era of singularities, is built more on this affirmative model, which is perhaps what you were talking about with, marrying someone with a little bit of the madness you see in yourself, right? Where it's not about suppressing their madness or your own, but kind of allowing them to flourish in tandem, a new folie à dos or something like this, right?
But I think this intuition was not lost upon Freud. And I can almost prove it to you in just 2 minutes. 1899, 1900, Freud comes out with his book on dreams, which I think most people know something about. And we could even say there's a Freudian aphorism, which isn't necessarily true, because Freud is much more wise than I think we give him credit for. Especially if you dig through the footnotes of Freud's work, you'll find what I mean. Especially Freud uses the word singularity in a footnote to dream interpretation, saying we finally convinced people to look at the latent content, but now they won't go the extra step and try and find the singularity of the psyche, the singularity of the dreamer.
The navel of the dream, or is that connected to it?
The navel. Yes, absolutely. But if you look at the basic Freudian aphorism, is that in our waking life, something of our satisfaction is not permitted for one reason or another. Because, of course, this is early modern capitalism. This is the expansion of the scientific discourse, but not to the lengths that we've seen. It's a period when neoliberalism wasn't a thought. Questions of globalization were a seed in the minds of many, but not something we were encountering as a real intellectual preoccupation, although that's debatable now that I mention it. I'm thinking of Kant's work on international... anyway, but the point is, he says, in our waking life, in some sense, we don't get what we want, but in our dreams, we do. So we have this dwelling space of satisfactions that can only be obtained in the sleeping state. And we have in the sleeping state what I call a phoneg, a false negation, which is Freud called censorship. It's not a real negative because censorship is the security of the satisfaction of the dream. It doesn't allow us to wake up. That's what censorship does. It censors so that you can keep enjoying yourself in your masturbatory republic. So while you're in this sleeping state, this dwelling state, you get your satisfactions. To some extent, this is a common reading. It's not the final word from Freud, but it's a model, let's say a topology. But if you move a few years later, especially into the 1920s, he's talking about symptoms. What are symptoms? Read his Inhibitions, Symptoms, and Anxiety essay, and there's a few lines where he'll say a symptom is a satisfaction that's allowed to pass without repression into waking life. We feel our symptoms in waking life. And so in some sense, our dreams are in our body, like an octopus dreaming. Go look at an octopus dreaming. You'll see how it dreams on the skin, in the body. I think we're very close. If Jordan Peterson likes the lobster, I like the octopus, okay? But you can see how the satisfactions are permitted to pass in waking life. And then you get to his later period, the period where Todd Defresne, a great thinker, friend of mine, anti-Freudian, who had a platform in Canada on CBC precisely to critique Freud. I respect his critique of Freud because Todd Defresne is a serious thinker and he does great work. I disagree with him, but he does great work. He's right in claiming that the late Freud is when he was most sociological. He's most sociological because he goes from dreams, 1900s, to symptoms, 1920s, to into the 1930s, myth. Myth, he starts to use, before this, he's looking at daydreaming, creative writers, and so on. But he's also looking at Moses, biblical traditions, and so on. He's looking at how we dream in waking life. And how is he interpreting the way we're acting in waking life, our myths? Through dream interpretation. He uses the exact same tools. Well, there's condensation here. So the satisfactions are now in waking life. At this moment, I think Freud becomes not only a true psychoanalyst, but also for that reason, a true sociologist. Because he's witnessing the unconscious in waking life. He's witnessing it like Lacan did when he stood at the window in Baltimore and said, look at these potholes, these streetlights, these are products of the unconscious. So at this moment, he's showing that, that myth is a way of dreaming in waking life. And so for that reason, if these are satisfactions that are allowed to pass in waking life, it's not a model, a sociological model that's built upon prohibitions. Where did the prohibitions go? It's a question. Now what you have in waking life are what I call phonegs, false negations, which I think so much of my work has gone in this direction. I'm trying to show that there's a lot of false twisting in critical theory today, a topological move. People are talking about ecstasy, but it's nothing of the sort. It's not a twist. People are talking about death drive, where it's not about death drive at all. It's actually something quite different. It's not a negative project. Death drive is Freud's most positive theory. It's a theory of positivity, of jouissance. It's not a theory of negation. We have false negations. We have false twists. We have all these new false criticalities that are dominating our public philosophy, particularly on the internet. And so my point was that Freud was already post-Foucauldian. He was already Lacanian in this way. And Lacan, you can see the same movement in Lacan's work. Sorry, I know I'm talking too much, but at the end of Lacan's work, he says, first he says, we wake up only to continue dreaming. Then he says, we never wake up. And he says, death is a dream. Death is a dream of each body. He has these wonderful little expressions in his late teaching that are really pithy, and they cut very quickly. And I think at the end, he's talking about myth. He even uses the word myth, which is why so many analysts today, I think, are very much interested in Roland Barthes. By the way, my final thought here, since I'm meandering, is that, Roland Barthes has this theory of myth as language robbery.
Is that in the mythologies or is that elsewhere? Because I don't remember this from the book
It's
Mythologies,
mythology.
but maybe I forgot this. I repressed it.
My idea is just that it's a false robbery. There's nothing at all robbed here. This is his
Okay.
idea. It's a pure satisfaction. It's la langue. All of that is just to say that I think if we read Freud carefully and seriously and deeply, with all the criticisms that his work deserves, I think we cannot help but come to the same conclusion that he's ahead of Lacan. He's already got these ideas, and we're still just catching up to him. There's all kinds of critiques in Freud, and I admit that. We can critique his cases, his Anna O case, his Dora case. We can critique all this stuff, but in so many ways, he was way ahead of us, and I'm still personally trying to catch up.
I know that when Coop and I approach Freud, and Coop, you can back me up on this, but we do try to be forthcoming with what might be taken as points of contention, specifically, because the fact that, reading something like Totem and Taboo, anti-Oedipus is like looming in the background for us since we spent so much time talking about it. Nevertheless, it's never a sort of washing over or covering over of anything that might be considered debatable. And of course, for Freud, this actually links up to my next point, although I want Coop, maybe I'll save it for a second. But at the same time, we do try to read Freud for what is the problem that he is trying to circumscribe and to bring out in relief. If that's a way of remaining faithful to Freud, I think, there's a little bit pushback, but also trying to see where he's pointing us and what kind of merit that journey would have. But Coop, I don't want to leave you out for this since I'm calling you out since we've talked about Freud so much on the show.
I don't know that I have anything that would be directly relevant, other than to say that our conversations on Freud tend to be the most enjoyable. To be honest, I don't know if it's like an interesting, maybe singularity of like all these different strands of thought, whether it be Deleuze and Guattari, Lacan, sociology. I think definitely it's usually something rich, and there's so many avenues of discussion that we just did one on.
Oh yeah, we did. We just did one on screen memories, by the way.
Yeah, screen memory, which of course goes to the discussion on dreaming that you brought up a bit there, which again, just so rich and just a short little text. I don't know. I just always enjoy them, maybe more than any of our other topics that we commonly discuss. So
that goes to Duane's point about unimpeded enjoyment, except now we're enjoying Freud without impediment.
Right.
I guess the way I was going to link onto one of the aspects of what you brought up, Duane, is that what do you think? Because I brought up, okay, so one of my favorite opening paragraphs in any of Freud's works is, I know Strachey translates it as instincts and their vicissitudes. This is where Freud lays out the drive, the four aspects with pressure and object and aim and source, etc. But he begins the essay by saying, science doesn't start with these well-defined concepts and then build up brick by brick. It has to kind of, at certain points, grope about in the dark, use kind of expedients and approximations, and be willing to be flexible and plastic and change and revise itself. I guess I wanted to bring out, I think you start in your introduction, which you may have written last, which is typical, but one of the things that I wanted to bring out was this tension perhaps between Freud's need, I'm not even criticizing him, but Freud's desire, if you will, his wish to see psychoanalysis established as a science versus Lacan's maybe, well, I'm not saying maybe, but his wariness of going too quickly in declaring or fighting for psychoanalysis as a science and seeing its discourse and its discursive possibilities as perhaps not needing to or even wanting to be sort of brought into the scientific fold insofar as there is a wariness about what science does, what kind of effects it might produce. I know this is one of the reasons why Lyotard's postmodernism, right, this report on knowledge, features throughout your work. I'm not saying Lacan is merely incredulous about the sort of unifying meta-narrative of science, for example, the grand unifying theory of like one equation that'll explain all physical phenomena. It's not just that, though. There is something about perhaps the discourse of science, whether it be the question of its ability to be subsumed under the university discourse for capitalistic projects and profits or other things. I just wanted you to have a space, a forum to maybe talk about this opening chapter, which extends to questions about sociology and its discursive possibilities, whether it be as science or in the quantitative mode or the qualitative mode. But I guess first I wanted to bridge Freud and Lacan again, since we were talking about them. Freud does definitely seem concerned about securing a firm foothold for psychoanalysis after he's gone, let's say, towards the end of his life. That's his baby and whatnot. But I think that his method of doing it, because he was trained as a scientist, that as we know, his move from, if you will, neurology to forging a new discourse of psychoanalysis. So I'm curious if you want to say a little bit, maybe linking Lacan's interest and wariness about psychoanalysis as science, and then perhaps how that relates to the crisis, if you will, that perhaps faces sociology or sociology's own embeddedness in this question of science.
What a beautiful question, honestly.
It's too open-ended, I know. I just want to give you the chance to respond.
And it's the big one. I think this is the big question. There's a lot I want to say. I'm going to try and restrict myself to a few notable points.
Oh, no prohibitions.
Well,
just kidding.
Freud, I think, not against his better judgment, but against his judgment as such. Let's say you said Freud's desire. I think we're right to question what Freud's desire was. And I think Lacan does this, and that's a whole nother can of worms that we could talk about. Miller does it wonderfully. Okay. Miller questions Freud's desires in a seminar titled The Analyst's Banquet. It's a real powerful critique against Freud. But against Freud's, let's say, longing to establish a science, I want to say so much about the context in which psychoanalysis emerged on the, let's say, as a consequence of science, which is something Lacan repeats endlessly. There's no psychoanalysis without the emergence of science as a discourse. But it's always a question of what science is for Lacan, and he switches his question a lot. But sticking to Freud, we can find elements in his work where he, in some sense, is fashioning a psychoanalytic defense against science and a particular type of science, a modality of science, one that I call sometimes pragmatic capitalist science, because I haven't a better word. Look at The Future of an Illusion. Look at his Civilization and its Discontents, where in a very popular passage, he talks about the triumph of science and man. Yeah. Marshall McLuhan took this idea from Freud. It's very clear in Freud that McLuhan took it in McLuhan's idea of the extensions of man, gadgets, or what Lacan in his later teaching, around the time of his teaching on capitalist discourse, he talks about gadgets and lathouses. And he even asks, will we ever come to a point where gadgets will not be symptoms? And in Civilization and its Discontents, Freud says, man has, as it were, become an auxiliary god. His gadgets extend him, let's say, I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact passage, but it's an explicit statement on science and science fashioning these gadgets, which produce symptoms that have something to do with the body. And he doesn't sound too happy about it. It's a critical passage from Freud. So I think Freud, like in many areas of his work, I think he's a little bit conflicted, despite his stated intentions. As for Lacan, he sometimes talks about science as a discourse. Sometimes he talks about it in all kinds of different ways. In his late teaching, he has a particular position that is quite interesting. He says science is death drive. He even goes so far, he says it just like that.
Mhm.
I think in La Troisième, I might be wrong. He says Freud hadn't thought of this fourth impossible profession, science. He places it in the impossible. And at this time, he's working a theory of the complicity of science and religion. He said religion will triumph precisely because of the death drive of science. If I could put it really naively, religion is meaning. Lacan even says, I think in La Troisième, I'm thinking spontaneously, so fact check me if you like. I think it's in La Troisième. He says something like, all meaning is religion at this point in his teaching. Science, on the other hand, is not the imaginary meaning so much. It's on the side of symbolic real. At this time, Lacan starts wondering, can we think of a new signifier, a new idea of the symbolic, a new idea of the real that would be what he calls traumatism, a whole, a real as a whole. He becomes more topological and this sort of stuff. And he goes so far as to say that, I don't know if he says it exactly like this, but this is in my reading. He says, could psychoanalysis be a refuge against science? It's a question. So we get a sense of science as a real. And I think this is what, in my own personal experience during COVID, I had felt intensely. It's not science as such, but the way in which a certain capitalist, pragmatic science had become dominant through the pharmaceutical industry and so on at the time of COVID, when it was like, here's another possible cure, here's another solution, we're going to do this. And it was like always another quick sort of pill solution that was being fashioned on the market to manage our social bonds. I think at the end, Lacan had thought that science, perhaps what he could call scientific discourse, was for him, I'm not saying it is for me, but for him, I think he might have saw it as the biggest threat. And yet he was also up against religion. So we have this sort of trinity, science, religion, psychoanalysis. It wasn't anymore a question of politics or anything like that. So those are just some coordinates. It's not an answer because it's a really big topic.
I think that makes sense, the sort of instrumentalization, and whereas I think you're right. There was something interesting in this question of prohibition, and of course, Lacan, God is dead means nothing is permitted, right? Like it's only.
But Taylor, you know what? Sorry, I'm being.
No,
really
please.
But you gave me a thought. I was reading the autobiography of who's that anarchist scientist, Feyerabend, Paul Feyerabend. Paul Feyerabend lived in a family system that was the ultimate system of prohibitions. His parents were Nazis. Okay, we know about the anti-Semitic legislation, of course. It was explicit prohibitions codified, right? Like, you shall not enjoy, the Jews enjoy too much, the homosexuals, communists, and so on. And, when you read Feyerabend, who's a scientist, whose idea of science is against method, no rules, anarchist science, anarchist epistemology, anarchist methodology. He said, and it's a lovely statement, when he was a child, he discovered very young, I don't remember what age, maybe 5 to 7, he discovered science already, and he keeps repeating something like it was the ultimate satisfaction. It was like the other side of the system of prohibitions. He saw this zone of satisfaction that he saw on the side of science. Science as a space without prohibition that would go beyond the prohibitions, that would be the other side of discourse, the other side of the social bond or whatever that was prevalent at his time. It was science. And for me, I think this isolates so much of what science was. I'll give you one or two more examples, and then I promise I won't interrupt you so much. You read Freud's work on the early Renaissance figures, Da Vinci. If you have the time, read Freud's essay on Da Vinci. It's wonderful because, again, it's one of these moments like his essay on the uncanny and so on, where I feel like he's got concepts that are slippery and you can't tell what he's quite talking about. With Da Vinci, I mean, it's the emergence of early capitalism, the emergence of a scientific discourse and so on. Freud seems obsessed with the fact that precisely what Da Vinci was on about was the sexual relation, not the lack of a sexual relation. He was literally drawing intercourse, the genitals intersecting, And he would go up and he would starve himself and sit at the canvas all day long just depriving himself of drink, of food. He was an anorexic. Anorexic, of course, are a symptom of scientific discourse, I would say, capitalist scientific discourse, and perhaps it's a rebellion, just like autism is. One of the ultimate anarchist rebellions against our current environment, which is not an environment of prohibition. He would sit there. Why do you think he would deprive himself of enjoyment, of eating? In some sense, he's trying to hollow himself out, in my reading, and I think it's implicit in Freud, of the satisfactions of science, which were too much, which is why he kept moving more and more toward scientific formula and this sort of stuff. Da Vinci's case is just fascinating, and so many of the early Renaissance figures. So anyway, I apologize. What you were saying made me think of those things, and I couldn't help myself. There were no prohibitions.
No. This is good. This is I know that it's a case study that's not a case study, right? You know, it's the reading Da Vinci and thinking about, as you said, the slippery concepts, and just thinking about how Freud's thinking through the Oedipus complex and Da Vinci and these things, and his sexuality, his homosexuality, all of these things. It makes a lot of sense, and I'm glad that you tied it in, this question of science and enjoyment, because there is a promise of enjoyment from science, just as on the side of religion you could see that too. There is at least the promise of a kind of stability in the organizing of the sort of battery of signifiers that allow enjoyment to be navigated and despite or because of its systems of prohibitions of what is allowed. So all of that makes sense, and I guess that does still link to sort of one of the last texts of Freud, as Coop mentioned, Moses of Monotheism. Freud is thinking about, and Future of the Illusion. You know, Freud committed atheist, but he's thinking about this question, right, of even if, you know, one is a committed atheist and does not believe in God and sees that as maybe an outcome of scientific rationality, at the same time, one cannot dismiss the fact that God, either a signifier or as part of that whole battery, that whole network of signifiers in lived experience, has real effects. Just as for Lyotard, as I brought up earlier, it's not necessarily just so much about progress, knowledge in and of itself. It's about what effects are possible and producible. That's what science is most interested in. And that speaks to a little bit of what I was talking about in science's instrumentalization. And perhaps that links maybe indirectly to your point about Lacan seeing science as death drive, because it is about, well, I know that opens a whole can of worms, but I'm really glad that we brought those together. And I will say, maybe just so we can open this up back to singularities, one of the real, you know, moving along in your book, I'm just trying to think chronologically, and I don't want to be able to cover everything, but I liked your introduction and your interest in Zimmel's work on, for example, on The Stranger. I do think Zimmel is one of those interesting characters that, you know, straddles philosophy and sociology, and sometimes therefore gets ignored by both sociologists and philosophers, which interestingly makes him a kind of stranger figure himself, right? But I liked your meditation on, your topological meditation, if you will, on the stranger extending from Zimmel. And so maybe this could be a space where we could talk a little bit about sociology. I know that will perk Coop's interest, but Zimmel, let's bring it back to sociology. And then I suppose we can just keep that going. I can't believe how much time we've already spent. I'm cognizant of how long we've already kept you. So I want to, I guess, move things along. And that's not a Coop. Cut this out, by the way. I'm rambling a little bit, but I'm trying to open up this topic because I know I have asked you a lot about Lacan, and I feel like I've prohibited Coop from talking about his what you wanted to enjoy today. Anyway, I'll shut up and open it up for you guys.
I was kind of just curious broadly as far as what connections, because I was thinking, you know, it's been a long time since I've actually read any logical literature or theory or what have you directly. But I was beginning to think about the school of, symbolic interactionism as having, at least on its face, there being some kind of links between, Lacan's thought with regard to language and symbols and how that dialogue or dialectic work, this sort of triangulation of these different strands of our, experience and how that begins to take shape. So I don't know if that's necessarily a question, but more of perhaps an opportunity to take us in the direction of how you see Lacan's relationship to sociology, maybe in a more specific realm when thinking about, because you do mention Irving Goffman's work in the book, who is one of the noted in the school of symbolic interactionism.
Symbolic interactionism is one of these inventions from America. Let's say it's a Western invention because it was Herbert Blumer who first used this phrase, I believe, and he used it to kind of retroactively capture a number of thinkers, which would include people from here and there, but specifically thinkers like George Simmel and Max Weber and so on. But it became very popular in the United States and even into Canada. I believe there's even a symbolic interactionist group still in the American Sociological Association. And I think it became part of a certain American cocktail. If you look at some of the others from the American tradition of sociology who got pulled into it, Irving Goffman, although some people consider him more of a structuralist, a microstructuralist, and it's debatable. I think he was an oddball. He passed through the Midwest and then he left again. So he was around. A lot of this thinking was happening in the Midwest. And I think that's important to point out what's happening in the Midwest, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in Chicago, the Chicago School of Sociology in close proximity and so on. You have thinkers like George Herbert Mead, like Charles Horton Cooley, like Jane Addams, and so on, that are developing a sociology alongside other philosophers. So much of sociology had as its foundation a thinking of the philosophy of the social bond. And they were producing a pragmatism, which we can see also in the work of C. Wright Mills and so many others. It's a certain American pragmatism that I started critiquing many years ago, and in some sense, I've recognized the pervasiveness of this pragmatism. The idea was that they were thinking alongside also Dewey, William James, and so many others. There's this idea of the cash value theory of truth, which is a certain type of, I don't know what to call it except for a contextual consequentialism. Whatever works, as Woody Allen said in one of his films. I think it was the title of one of his films, very New York film, very American film. In this sense, I think this is in some way, it's part of the American ideology. It's also a nice statement on capitalist discourse. Because what's happening here is a pragmatism, what works. And I think in psychoanalysis for Lacan, it begins with what doesn't work. So already we have different points of departure from the very beginning. George Simmel's work was very important in this thinking of a certain taken for granted understanding of, I don't know what to call it except for alterity, of strangeness, which, if I could develop a meta-language, I would say perhaps there's nothing but meta-language. This was also Lacan's later point. It's not that there's no meta-language in the late Lacan. Everything's meta-language. There's no language in the late Lacan. So you get this idea of what Simmel called a stranger who is in the group, but not of the group. That's his exact expression. If there's anybody who's interested in mathematics, in set theory, they will recognize this is the same definition of, I think, the empty set or something. I'm not a mathematician. It's in, but not of.
Belongs, but it's not included,
It's
right?
belong, but not include. Yes, belonging and inclusion. Yes, same sort of idea that Simmel was working with. He had the idea that he would think a sociology of mathematics in this certain way. He talked about the dyad, the triad, but really he was developing a social geometry. And I think this model gets taken up in America in symbolic interactionism. You see it at its height in the work of Patricia Hill Collins, who first got her claim to fame talking about the experiences of African American women in sociology communities who were on the periphery, who felt like strangers in their own discipline. Oh, they talked too loud. There was all this prejudice. And then, of course, what happens in the contemporary period, she became president of the American Sociological Association, which shows you how strangeness can become elevated to the very principle of a social bond. What is foreign becomes singular, which is the basic idea. So I think this model from Simmel, which is really pervasive and still kind of a gold standard in much of sociological thinking and in a lot of symbolic interactionism. There's so much I want to say about the place of the big other in symbolic interactionism. I'll forego that. But I think what Simmel couldn't conceive of is a topology. And I think that's what my work tries to deal with, to move from geometry to topology. Instead of something near that's far and far that's near, I want to think of something that's so near that it's far in the sense that it's singular. So the stranger is not alienated within a group. The stranger is the group. And this is my fundamental critique of Simmel. By the way, there's some of these American sociologists. Robert K. Merton is one of them, who was, in his essay on the sociology of knowledge, had a couple lines in that essay where he talked about this property of singularity. He didn't call it singularity. Symbolic interactionism got off on the wrong foot. And there's a reason why a lot of the people who contributed to that tradition encountered Freud, critiqued Freud, abandoned the most fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, namely repetition, the unconscious, drive, and so on, and characterized Freud as a biological determinist and a thinker of naive instincts and this sort of stuff. They were interested in what works. So I think that's all I can really say off the cuff on why I talked about symbolic interactionism in the book.
How does this strike you as far as, I don't know if like perhaps Durkheim's theory of deviancy, for example, does that have any kind of purchase with where you're discussing, because the deviant in this sense has a positive function of really kind of generating a sort of social bond, perhaps you could say, within the in-group, and the deviant certainly is part of kind of has that same relation to the kind of set you were discussing. Am I on the right track as far as that's concerned with?
It's wonderful you said that, because you know what it makes me think of? It makes me think of a deviation, which is what the stranger was for Simmel, of course. The deviant deviates, in a sense, goes astray, like a rogue state goes astray from the solidarity of nations. I write about this in the book as well, the rogue state, and how the rogue state went from being a deviant sort of member who maybe was included but didn't belong, I might have that backwards, to the evil empire, where it was literally a singularity. It wasn't even a part of the community anymore, and there was no thought that there would be any remedial efforts with them. I'll give you a concrete example. When I was a child in high school, there was this event, let's say around the Reagan years. There's this event every Friday. It was a terrible event that bullies in my school would involve themselves in, called Beat the Freak Night. And the idea was we call them normies now, but the normies would go out and they'd beat the stranger, the deviant, because they were in the classroom, but not really a part of the classroom. We needed to beat them into conformity. I say I wasn't a part of that. I was more afraid because I might have been a recipient of it. But did you notice that the shift that happened? Today, we say, let your freak flag fly. We'll say, we're all monsters. Like, everybody today celebrates their unique monstrosity in public. Maybe not monstrosity, because that might have negative connotations, whatever. We celebrate the fact that we're all different and none of us are quite a part of the same thing. And this sort of thing. I think that demonstrates precisely the shift that I'm trying to show. A shift from deviance as a deviation from something normal or common to the group, a common identity, a common norm, whatever, toward the group itself as deviant, as the very principle of the group is to establish itself as a deviant entity. Donald Trump will say, I'm an outsider, Nobody likes me, everybody's out to get me. And he was establishment in a certain sense. And yet he presented himself as an anti-establishment candidate. So I think there's a lot of this happening in society today, which isn't, you know what George Simmel says that I love? George Simmel says our task is neither to condemn nor condone. It's a psychoanalytic principle, but simply to understand.
I guess there's two things. One, Coop, is it keep Austin weird or strange?
Keep Austin weird.
Keep Austin weird. So where his city has its own kind of slogan. I would say too, just reflecting that this is one could sort of tie in your points here about singularity and deviance with Deleuze and Guattari's reflections on the majoritarian and the minoritarian. And so even if I think that less and less we are, if following, for example, this logic of keep Austin weird, it's less and less how the majoritarian as a standard of being, living, existing, of valuing is taken as an authoritative principle, held up to scrutiny, if you will. And I think that too, just the notion of Zimmel's notion of the stranger, right? That geometry, and you're talking about a topology. I couldn't help but think of like the Kleineman as that primordial deviation that allows atoms at all to interact. There's something interesting going on where the stranger, as you said, can even be elevated to a principle of sociality, right? There is a sort of Kleineman function to that aspect.
Doesn't that kind of align with, I was just thinking about this, maybe it's from the Schrader book, where there's this negative, this exclusionary principle of property is what sort of generates a type of sociality, a type of social, I don't know, bond per se. I don't know if that's right.
And that was Hegel
exactly.
too.
Yeah,
that was Hegel too. It's precisely in alienating my free will. My freedom is alienated in property, but that alienation, well, really, his word is externalization. But obviously, the fact that I externalize my freedom in property, it requires others to recognize that, right? So now you've already got a social dialectic, which goes through mutual recognition, which is where I think that's why it's a more classical, or we can even say modern theory, rather than this new era, whether we call it postmodern or not, where the question of mutual recognition as the basis. I'm starting to reflect on our conversation, and it seems like seeing it as the motor of the dialectic of sociality is perhaps wrong way around, right? There's something that needs to be stood on its head, where it seems like an effect rather than the dialectical motor. Now, obviously, that would cause us to rethink the way that Hegel, gets his engine started, but I would have to reflect more on that.
I was just thinking about the way that sort of it's the difference element that kind of in itself, I don't know, it's this weird, it's the strange dialectic of almost, to go to Cooley and the notion of like the looking glass self, where it's like, it's this mediation in terms of my personal identity, my singularity is in this kind of constant two-way dialogue with how other people see me and how I perceive the way that others see me, that allows me to constitute myself in this kind of triangle. Maybe that's the geometry aspect that you were getting at, Duane. I don't know if any of that brings any interesting thoughts to mind.
This is the problem. It's captured to be captured in infinity, which is paradoxically not to be captured at all. Because I think there's so much here. Because one of let's go back to our discussion before you started recording, if I may. Stirner's contribution to the young Hegelians, to Feuerbach, of course. I think what he showed is that there's a movement from dialectics to worse, repetition. From dialectics to what's worse, repetition. I'm somewhat taking this idea from Rick Luce, a psychoanalyst who I heard speak in Dublin maybe a year or two ago, where he made this very clear distinction. He said, dialectics, repetition. The idea, I think, of psychoanalysis in the late Lacan, just a brief thing on Lacan, is this idea that progress could lead us to actually, it could be even worse. And what's worse is the repetition. And what Stirner located, in some sense, in Feuerbach's work was a repetition that's worse. God, now displaced into the category of man, the category that Nietzsche, of course, I think stole, into a worse position, because it's even worse with the category of man, says Stirner. And that's the first point. The second point I wanted to say is I think we're actually closer to Althusser's sort of mode of recognition. Because, you know, the way Althusser, in his famous, it's taught in university classes all around the world all the time for the last 40 years, 60 years, I don't know how long, ever since Althusser made his mark at the École Normale. This idea of interpolation, where you're turning around. You know what? I read that numerous times. You know what Althusser loves? Science. Second point is Althusser. Well, he advocates science as the antidote to, in some sense. This is very naive. Please forgive me, to ideology.
Yes.
But it's the only true outside to ideology. That's one reading anyway. And although he says there's no outside to ideology, I get it. But you get this interpolation. Here's the question: where's the prohibition? Is there a prohibition in this interpolation? I claim when Althusser turns and he's hailed and he's identified by the police officer, my idea is he joined the Fraternal Order of Police. It was identification. And I think the same stuff's going on with Cooley. My final point having to do with what I've heard you say, and I feel like it's really important because it's something that's been unsaid in a lot of what we've been talking about until now, and I should have said it earlier, is I think in some sense I'm also in this book being a bit like Marshall McLuhan. I'm trying to say, what's the environment? Is there a counter environment? Because I think what all of this means in the movement from, let's say, patriarchy to patriarchy 2.0, the father and the real, what's worse, and so on, is our environment shifts. Our environment today, I think, is increasingly one of limitlessness. It's the new tyranny. We're trapped in infinity more and more. And I think it's not this repressive power structures that are like robbing us of our enjoyment or repressing us or whatever. That exists, but it exists in the tyrannical mode. I think it's what we're really struggling with is how to live in infinity. And I'll give you a concrete example. Concrete example is the world of video games. Here's a real McLuhan analysis of video games. When I was a child, I would play video games just like I would read a book. It was a literate culture. Super Mario World 1. Level 1, it's a side scroller. From left to right, turn the page, World 1, 2. Left to right, and then new chapter, World 2. Turn the page, side scroller. And there were limits to the environment. There were some hacks and so on where you could transgress, get into a warp zone, and you finally have an orgasm or whatever. But so my apologies. But today, look at video games. You are thrown into a world. They give you the pieces. They say, invent some rules. And I don't know what the hell to do in these worlds. If you look at the younger generations, my son's 13 years old, he's in a process not of being in a world, but of world building. He's learning to build worlds, to build grammar, syntax in these infinite spaces, to build caves and so on. Minecraft, the first one I saw was Mario Maker. If you want to go even further, I mentioned George Ritzer, an American sociologist who's very famous. He invented a neologism that sounds a bit Deleuzian, actually. It's a wonderful concept, prosumer capitalism. He brings together, he says, we're in prosumer capitalism. The first example he gives is IKEA. You buy the product comes to you, you have to build it, but you're not paid for building it. You used to pay somebody else. And it's the same with building your Big Macs. Now you build it yourself, or you do it online. In Pakistan, we have a thing called Food Panda. I can build it. And the education system has become this way, build your own programs and this sort of stuff. So I think what we're witnessing more and more is that we're not in this phallic, hegemonic world. The thinking of Gramsci, I think, makes absolutely no sense in this world. We're tyrannized by infinity. And I think this is the situation that we have to live in. And this exists in the era of singularities. In this time is, I think, when we feel it the worst, which is last thing I'll say, why so many patients, well, maybe it won't be, there's no limits, is that a lot of patients come to see me and they're barricading themselves in their bedrooms. It's almost like they say they can't get out of their room. They can't find value for their creative labor. So they're not exactly proletariat. They're not in a factory having their products robbed of them. They have their products and they're stacking them up. Their paintings, their podcasts. Actually, podcasts are a great invention because they do reach out to the world from the bedroom often.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the bedroom, in some sense, is not a problem for them. It's a solution. They're barricading themselves from an infinite universe. So anyway, I think that's the whole thing. It's a question of how to build counter environments today.
Along those lines, I was thinking of Durkheim's concept of anomie and this kind of normlessness. I don't know, does that have any connection to what you're sort of arguing? I'm just thinking about the kind of contradictions that we see with respect to, like, I think you're onto something as far as the desire for the father people seem to be so preoccupied with wanting the father, the phallus. It seems to be so pervasive in our culture. And so that kind of makes sense that it's sort of this reaction to this lack of the presence of the father. But yet on the same coin, other side of the coin, we have something like wokeness. I'm sorry to bring it up, but I think it does exemplify this notion of what is permitted, what is not permitted, and I guess the onus being placed on the individual to determine their freedom in a sort of Sartrean fashion. But like wokeness itself has been compared by many to a sort of religion, right? Which even also makes sense in the without a father symbol, something else has to stand in its place. But it's interesting that the battle over wokeness, which really I think goes back to deviance and the social bond, ultimately is, do we want a rule set or do we not want rule? Because there seems to be like both sides. It's this very dialectical aspect where on one side you have the people that want to prohibit, gender conformity, yada, yada, has to be this, you have to behave in this way, but they react so vehemently against any prescription of like wokeness being its own prohibition against behaving in a certain fashion, right? So it's kind of an odd, difficult, social path to navigate to really, but I don't know. I don't know if that has any relevance, but that's some of the things that kind of jumped in my mind reading the book.
Every relevance, because what Durkheim called collective effervescence, which I think you mentioned earlier, anomie, living without the father. Is anomie living without, was that low?
It's like without rules, because there's the law of the logos, and then there's the kind of social norms, the unwritten laws of nomos. So I think it's kind of lawlessness or without regulation, without rules. Obviously, Greek is much more polysemous than anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Yeah, but that's it. I think Durkheim had a sense of it, but he was on the tails of positivism. He was an inheritor of Auguste Comte's work, and he was trying to build an institution of sociology and trying to demonstrate its practical mode of engagement to be distinguished from other disciplines. And so he was caught up in a lot of things, and he had an idea of structure as something that pre-existed us, that determined us, and that we're kind of like language. He even said language was a social structure. He didn't fully explore it, but of course he said language is there before we're born. We have to get born into language, and
the symbolic, right? Castration and all of that good stuff.
Yeah, so he had a sense of things, but with collective effervescence, you could have gone much further, because here we have, well, let's talk about wokeness. I think wokeness is not about prohibition, in a sense. I agree with what you're saying entirely. Let's say its manifestation as cancel culture. What is it? It's segregation. Because in my book, I show the strange homology between so-called cancel culture and foreign agent laws in Russia. I don't know if you know about foreign agent laws in Russia, but I was acutely aware of them because when I was in Russia, I witnessed people that I knew being kicked out of the country, being labeled a foreign agent. Basically, if you had any possible funding coming vaguely from George Soros or something like that. They would say, you're a foreign agent, and then you had to publicly declare yourself as such, admit that you are, before you can even engage in any sort of social discourse. So you can see the strange homology. I think that this is what we can expect in an era of singularities. And my whole idea is when we look into the soul of Russia, contemporary Russia, and we see foreign agent laws, we should recognize that we're much more Russian in our ways in the West than we believe. We have the same stuff happening here. So that's the first thing. I think it's about segregation. I think it's about, because the old idea was if you accepted the nom de pair, let's say prohibition, as your price of admission into a social bond, and maybe you can't live with it, so you have neurosis or something like that, you've accepted a certain device that splits you internally. There's a splitting device that's internalized. You might not accept it. You might not be capable of living with the consequences, but you've accepted something like that. With segregation and, let's say, cancel culture and so on, the split is always rejected out. You spit it out. You spit the split out into the world, and you recognize it as a threatening, castrating device in some sense. All these people are like, here's a question, and I know it's really not politically correct, and please forgive me because I'm only experimenting with my own ideas, so go gently with me. Sure. But I can't help but notice that at a time when people are more aware of patriarchy than they've ever been, vocally aware, that's when people seem to feel it even worse too. That's interesting to me. That's why I say patriarchy 2.0, it's the father's even worse. He's in the real now. It's not purely in the symbolic. And people really do suffer there. So what happens to the name of the father, the nom de père, is for Lacan, he does a very interesting move. He says the symptom, which is a singular symptom for each speaking being, can be an anchoring principle in the world. The symptom can become a nom de père. I think that's what's kind of lost in us. I don't know what that would mean quite practically, but in the clinic and one by one, we can see how that can ground you in the world. Just to answer the question on Durkheim, I think there's something there on collective effervescence, which is very close to what I'm calling a singular social order. He describes it as like an energy, right? And you see how in Freud and a lot of the thinkers at this time, they're adopting the theories of thermodynamics and energy. And I don't know which law of thermodynamics, I'd have to go check, but one of them says the energy can never be truly squandered. It just gets relayed around, And so it moves around in the group in this sort of way. And I think that that's what constitutes many of today's newest social movements. They form groups in this energetics. They're sharing this jouissance together against the world.
You also see this, if we're going to stick with wokeness for a minute, because I didn't say anything about it, and I guess I'm just reflecting on the conversation. You see more and more, you see it as a kind of doubling, a doppelganger of what we used to call, what was the word? It was...
You're not talking about politically correct, right?
No, it's something similar. It's virtue signaling. There's a kind of we are the outsiders because we're not woke, but that's the new inside group, and so there's a kind of virtue signaling in the anti-woke for the anti-woke for that new group. And there's also more and more purity testing, right? It's kind of any sort of kowtowing to even science, legitimate science, trying to say, well, your understanding of a binary and the sexes or in gender is not scientific. That itself becomes a part of the ideological or whatever it wants to be, And I think that there's a sense in which there's a commitment to. I do feel like, Coop, if you were saying, and I think I understood you, that there's if wokeness is treated as by the outside, by the anti-woke, if you will, but as religion, that description doesn't leave them outside of religion, right? It's just a different denomination, because it's kind of what Duane was saying earlier. There is a sense in which the pre-establishment of the coordinates of meaning is a means for accessing, or a means for the sort of surplus of jouissance, right? The surplus enjoyment is precisely in the fact that anything that would shatter sort of third grade biology or whatever it is you want to call it, right? It's not even third grade biology, really. It's more received and assimilated notions of how humans are to be, right? This gets us a little bit back to Stirner, because now it's not just about the human in the abstract. It's like, well, the human as, again, it's a question of the woke having not the woke, those who are using that terminology. There's already an idealization of what man should be, including man as both the sex and the species should be, right? And I think that is a kind of that spook, to use Stirner's term, right? That phantasm, that idealization governs their principle. But it's also there is a lot of since a lot of the stuff is online, a lot of it is kind of sometimes driven along, like in America, along party lines, although it doesn't merely adhere to that, which is why this question of who's on the right and on the left is so strange, since the Democrat Party is center right itself. So, I mean, like, coordinates are all fucked up. But I do think that this aspect of religion, just to think about it and its role to play, sure, I do think that there can be a fervor and there can be a kind of false piety on the side of those who are quote unquote woke. But it is a question about, I guess, for me, if I were to call myself woke, whatever that means, I don't see it as a kind of stable set of ideas. I do feel like there is something about, again, if you're anti-woke, you're already going to be reactionary against something. So calling that as a label for me seems more restrictive. But those weren't coherent thoughts. I just spontaneously, like, kind of dialoguing with you guys on this subject. I think that we'll see this language die out. A new signifier would probably take its place. We saw the notion of
I mean, we've already gone from
signaling
CRT to DEI to, like, you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. We're going to, and maybe the acronyms will keep changing too, right? So, it's hard to keep up with. And I think that part of it is the fact that you and I, Coop, and Duane, I assume you as well, we're all plugged into social media. I do feel like the less online we are, we might be a little bit more inured to that, or maybe not even inured, because we are some sense inured. I guess we would be less aware of those changing trends of discourse.
Right. Yeah.
So maybe that's a little bit of the contamination that we have to suffer with too.
Sure. Yeah.
And Duane, it's interesting, just as an off the cuff thing, and then we can maybe start to wind down and give you a forum to talk about what you're working on for the future. I do want to say that one of the things that Coop and I have talked about is that as much as we may see the negative side of social media, and we can see it getting worse perhaps every day, the fact that it does allow true connections between peoples that would have never perhaps had the chance to meet one another and talk. Coop and I wouldn't have met without Twitter. Duane, you and I, maybe some friend of a friend could have put us in contact, but we were able, through the algorithm of, I think, Facebook, just having so many mutual friends and shared interests. There are ways in which that aspect of social media can and should be critiqued, especially in its different modalities. But I can't help but feel like for me, the good outweighs the bad. Maybe on some days when I'm doom scrolling, I but when I really reflect on the friendships and relationships I've been able to make, it's kind of one of those things where I am glad that I haven't fully, gone offline or something like this. I haven't fully foreclosed those possibilities.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I've had to reorient myself with social media. How do I relate to it? I remember on Twitter, I felt quite overwhelmed a few times. I felt like, I even spoke about it on a podcast one time. I felt like, once I start to see the groups of people in their effervescence, tribalizing, and it feels like it felt quite overwhelming, and I had to unplug from Twitter for that reason. since then, I've learned how to reorient myself to social media, and I kind of get more out of it. What did Winston Churchill say about alcoholism? He's not an alcohol. Was it Churchill? Not an alcoholic because I get more out of alcohol than alcohol gets out of me.
Well,
That's
I
how
remember
feel
your
about-
I remember your quoting of Norm Macdonald's joke, like alcoholism is a disease, but it's like, isn't that a good one to have, or like the best one to have? Anyway, so yeah, I guess I was just reflecting on the fact that it's easy, I think, to broadly categorize social media, and sometimes I do tend to over categorize it as merely this negative force, and I just don't think that's true. And I think that it's just there's really no going back, barring and again, this is maybe the whole end of the world, rather than easier to think the end of the world than the end of capitalism. I do think that barring some sort of massive catastrophe, I think that and that goes for other things like you analyzed in your book about ChatGPT, which we didn't even get to. I guess this kind of leaves us on the threshold of some of the other ideas that you brought up in the book. I know social media itself wasn't as directly analyzed, but I'm sure you could extend some of the things positively that you said about AI and ChatGPT. Obviously positive without a sort of naive technologic belief in progress, because we've already discussed that. I think that it will become a part of that new social bond topography or topology that you were talking about, is the kind of singularities that we meet on the internet, and many of them faceless, right? Many of them nameless. I consider some of the friends on Twitter, you can call them imaginary friends if you want, but you interact with them and have actual discourse with them. But I don't know their names. I don't know their faces, right? They're these kind of PFP images, but I have like a fondness for that, right? So there's this interesting, that's an interesting aspect
Right.
of strangeness that I was reflecting on going through your book. And gosh,
That's good. I like that.
I'm just thinking there's so much more we could talk about, and I know that around 2 hours is the sort of allotted time. And as I told you before the show started, there's always this surplus, right? There's always too much of a good thing. But I do want to give you the chance, Duane, to mention anything you've got going on. Perhaps you're working on some articles or books at the moment. Maybe there's something that's forthcoming in publication. Really, this is just your chance to let the listeners know and let us know what we may see from you in the future, which we obviously have to have you on a third time.
It's a great question. I've been moving away from writing a little bit and focusing on something more hands-on. I mean that in a psychoanalytic sense, hands-on, meaning more localized to my body. I've really become quite fanatical about building institutions. And so, I'm in Pakistan here, and Pakistan has a curious relationship to psychoanalysis. We could say it doesn't have a history, or its history existed before it did, because the only real link to psychoanalysis was one Masad Khan, who went to study in the United Kingdom, eventually becoming a patient and close friend of Donald Winnicott, just a year before the partition, before Pakistan existed. After that, there's been really no psychoanalysis in the Freudian sense. So for the last year and a half or so, I've been working very hard to change that. And not simply because it's my desire, although that's certainly a part of it, but because a lot of people have been coming to my talks and things like that whenever I speak about psychoanalysis, and it shows that there's a demand for it. And I've heard the demands. I run a practice here as well. And so, I started with a WhatsApp group that has maybe 30 to 40 people in it now from around Pakistan. That's just a WhatsApp group. We have a website, psychoanalysispakistan.com. I'm able to teach courses on psychoanalysis here. I run cartels, and I'm working on building partnerships where we can eventually have something of a training institute. We have a conference next summer, a national conference on psychoanalysis. And, we're working on things with other universities. I have people coming in flying people in to do some work with me who are analysts in other countries. And I've got a series of guest lectures from people like Graham Harman, Leon Brenner, Daniel Tott, and Stin Van Hool, and Ellie Raglan, and so many others, Arka Chattopadhyay, and all these others to speak about psychoanalysis here. So this is where I'm devoting my energies, which is more quiet, but it allows a place for psychoanalysis. And that's what I'm really excited by more than anything else. I do have some writings coming out, but who knows what that means or what it'll be. No point in talking about it.
It is interesting that, given the little bit that you've told us about the different lands that you've sometimes chosen to move to, sometimes been displaced from, you have had this recent history of being the stranger, right? That we've talked about, the singularity. And so you're doing something similar by bringing or helping to bring psychoanalysis to Pakistan and making a group hustle that can sort of have real effects. That's great. I can see why you might see that as more meaningful, impactful than perhaps another publication. That makes a lot of sense to me.
The other thing is just because I see the importance of, what I learned from my trans patients. It was a real lesson for me, the importance of the body. I mean that in all kinds of philosophical and psychoanalytic ways. But I even had the curious thought that having 4 walls for students to sit in is worth the price of tuition, irrespective of the content. It sounds crazy, like most of what I say, but I mean, look, when I was in Mumbai in COVID times, we were forced to give talks on Zoom. And obviously this works for us because I can see the way signifiers are hitting our bodies in some sense here. But in a big classroom, we had people who were doing this look, I don't know, maybe this is going to just be sound, but furrowing their brows, and they looked they were pensive, and
Rodin's thinker type thing, right? Or
yeah, and I was thinking that, well, this is a really curious moment for them to be in deep thought, because I'm not saying anything that's that profound. And then I started to notice it happened every 15 minutes. It was a hologram. And it occurred to me, that the body is a prerequisite for thinking. Now, this is something a lot of people can debate with me about, but this is something that I discovered through my own experience. And so it's becoming more and more important for me to have spaces where we would not be without a body. That's why I think it's so important to me, but I think to the people who want to bring their bodies to the clinic and to these spaces. So, I mean, it has online components and everything too. We run some hotels online and so on. It's not to discount the online, but for me personally, I've decided to scale back to my hands and feet and to bang my head against the wall.
That's good. Even though something new might not come out, another book or so for a few years, we'll definitely have to have you on before then, and we can always look back into your discography, so to speak, and play another record, and talk about something else, because we definitely scratched the surface of the book, but I think we got into some of the details and I do want to thank you for coming back and spending your Sunday night, or is it Monday morning now? I don't even know.
Just on the cusp of midnight. Yeah,
there you go.
11:20. Yeah.
So why don't we let you get back to it? I don't know if you're a night owl like I am, so we should let you get some good rest. You've earned it, and you said you have had a long day, so I appreciate you willing to meet us after a long day. I do think it's interesting when the episode ends, it's always good to have more questions and more ideas than you did when you started. So food for thought, my friend.
But also, thank you both for offering this dwelling space in an era of foreclosure. I really appreciate it. These platforms are wonderful, and your platform in particular is wonderful because of its dialogical way and your hospitality to some crazy ideas. You're very kind. Thank you so much.
Duane, I will be in touch with you. It'll probably be about a month, so maybe around
possibly
Halloween.
Longer. Yeah, I'm getting
maybe longer.
It's getting increasingly difficult to get the episodes edited. Basically, which is what I do.
it's because of that girlfriend you got. So
but he's the OG. Look at his hat.
Exactly.
Okay, so it'll probably maybe be then early mid-November, but I will be in touch and I will let you know as soon as it drops, and we will put in the show notes the website you just mentioned, psychoanalysispakistan.com. Is that what it was? Yeah.
Yes, it is. Thank you so much.
And obviously show notes for the book that just released. I don't know what month, but by Bloomsbury, Psychoanalytic
It was 2 weeks
Sociology.
ago.
It was 2 weeks ago. Well,
Yes.
it'll still be pretty hot off the shelves when the listeners get to this episode. But I'll let you know as soon as it drops. And thank you again for being with us today. And hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Yes. See you soon. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks again, Duane. And once again, thanks to Duane Rousselle for joining Taylor and I on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. Signing off.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.